It is a huge pleasure to introduce Professor Hyde, Beth Hyde, this evening. She's currently the Acting Associate Dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Kean University in New Jersey, where she's also Professor of History. Alongside all of that, she's also the editor of the respected journal we now know as Studies in the History of Gardens and Designed Landscapes. Beth has published widely herself with a long list of journal articles to her name, as well as several books, including Cultivated Power, Flowers, Culture and Politics in the Reign of Louis XV, which has had much critical acclaim and is, I suspect, well known to many of you. Beth's now in the throes of writing a new book to be called Of Monarchical Climates and Republican Soil, Nature, National and Botanical Diplomacy in the Franco-American World. This builds on her research into the French botanist André Michaux and his work in North America, which Beth has kindly agreed to talk to us about this evening. The transatlantic exchanges, which are her subject, will give us another new insight into how and why garden styles and plants have moved around the globe. And I'm extremely grateful to Beth for contributing to our Conversations Across Continents programme. And perhaps I should add a small thank you to Zoom for making it possible for us to enjoy her paper from across the Atlantic. Welcome, Beth, and thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Pippa, for your wonderful, very kind introduction, and thank you for the invitation. I'm absolutely delighted to be joining you all in early afternoon here, of course, early evening there, and I too am grateful that Zoom has made it possible for us to carry on these conversations across the globe and across oceans in the way that we're going to be exploring plant exchange today. So as Pippa said, this is work that is based on my research into André Michaux, but I'm also attempting to situate André Michaux in this larger context of plant exchange between France and North America, using him as a window into this world, using him to understand the many goals and objectives that were connected to Franco-American plant exchange in this period. So in 1787, the Reverend, excuse me, let me get my slides moving. There we go. In 1787, the Reverend Manasseh Cutler traveled from Massachusetts to New York and Philadelphia as part of a mission to present to Congress a plan for the settlement of Ohio. A Yale graduate who'd studied medicine and religion and practiced both in the American Revolution, he was a botanically curious man, traveling with the equipment that he needed to gather plant specimens and consulting libraries and scientific collections at Yale, Columbia, and Princeton along the way. He carried a letter of introduction with him to André Michaux, the superintendent of the French King's Botanical Garden in New Jersey. The garden, constructed by Michaux on behalf of the French government near present-day Hoboken, New Jersey, was intended to serve as a nursery for trees and other plants gathered by the botanist Michaux as he traveled around the mid-Atlantic and southern Appalachians of North America, charged by the King of France and D'Angeville, the head of the King's Botanical Gardens, with locating specimens that might be easily acclimatized in France. They were especially interested in trees that could help both in the reforestation of France and in the furnishing of much needed timber for the construction of a French navy capable of competing with the British. Michaux's garden was in fact the culmination of escalating French attempts to gather North American specimens that had, up to Michaux's arrival, taken the form of asking French diplomats to collect and purchase plants and seeds from landed Americans and seedsmen to be sent to France. At the same time, the French Navy had sent its own agents to procure timber samples. But when these approaches were deemed insufficient, the French government sent their own botanists to do the job. To facilitate his work, Michaux decided to establish a nursery garden in which to gather and propagate North American plants, you see the plan of it here, to optimize chances for successful shipment to France. He selected a plot of land in New Jersey, where he could gather specimens from New England and the mid-Atlantic and be near the pack boats departing regularly from New York to France. New Jersey laws, in fact, prohibited the purchase of land by non-citizens, so Michaud appealed to New Jersey Governor William Livingston for help. Livingston had already encountered French botanical diplomacy. When asked for sensitive information about the state of New Jersey, he was thanked for that information with a gift of seeds from the French king's garden. So Livingston asked the state assembly to make it possible for Michaud to purchase the land. They did so. He began construction of the garden and the house that you see here and proceeded with his primary mission, the gathering of specimens of North American trees, as well as ornamental and utilitarian plants to be sent back to France. He would go on to travel widely around North America and establish a similar garden in Charleston, South Carolina. Here you see the present site of that garden. It now encompasses a cemetery, warehouses, a rail yard, and in the very back you can see the Meadowlands football stadium and the surrounding areas. Here's the Charleston Garden. Word of the garden's establishment spread quickly. The Political Intelligencer and New Jersey Advertiser reported from Elizabethtown, New Jersey on April the 19th of 1786 that Mr. Michaud, botanist to his most Christian majesty, having purchased a lot of ground at Weehawken near the Three Pigeons, is erecting a garden there, which for magnificence will far surpass anything of the kind in America, and in it is introduced many exotic and domestic botanical curiosities. By 1787, the same paper revealed expectations growing. The paper reported that, quote, part of this space is at present enclosing with a stone wall a universal collection of exotic as well as domestic plants, trees, and flowers already begun to be introduced to this elegant spot, which in time will rival, if not exceed, the most celebrated gardens of Europe. The situation is naturally wild and romantic between two considerable rivers in view of the main ocean, the city of New York, the heights of Staten Island, and a vast extent of distant mechanisms on the western side of the landscape. I've left up this modern image of the site, this contemporary image of the site on purpose, because this area, the Meadowlands area, the wetlands area, is a very swampy area. Because it is so swampy, does not smell well. It's now filled with a lot of chemical plants in addition to the kinds of warehouses and things that you saw in the previous pictures. And so many believe that this area really encompasses all of the negative stereotypes and ideas that people have about New Jersey, in fact. But for Michaud, it represented exactly why New Jersey remains in American geographical standards a central place in America where you can get easily to New York, to the Atlantic Ocean. And for Michaud, that was the appeal of this particular site. But given the exaggeration, Manasseh Cutler's disappointment must have been all the more keenly felt when, upon returning from Philadelphia, he was determined to make, as he wrote in his diary, Monsieur Michaud a visit, to whom I had letters. When Cutler finally found the garden, he was disappointed, writing, unfortunately, Michaud was gone to the Carolinas. There were several gardeners, but they appeared to understand little of botany. There was a considerable collection of exotic shrubs and plants set in a kind of beds for transplanting. The American plants they had received were mostly sent to France. There was no order nor beauty in the gardens, the soil remarkably sandy and poor, the situation wretched, and the way to it is as bad as well can be conceived. Of all the places in America, this would have been the very last I should have thought of for such a purpose. What could induce Michaud to fix down in the awful, gloomy, lonely, miserable spot is beyond my power to conceive. I was never more disappointed and regretted the pains I had taken to see the ill taste and judgment of the botanical Frenchman. The contrasting descriptions of Michaud's garden are rooted, of course, in American expectations of a European scale of magnificence that they believed would appear in this garden. But they're also, of course, rooted in competing aesthetics of garden and landscape design in the 18th century. Cutler's desire for order and beauty reflected a taste for the French formal garden style perfected in the 17th century, in which order expressed through geometry, axiality, and symmetry contributed much to the perception of the garden's beauty. Well, the newspaper account, citing the wild and romantic setting of the garden, uses language of the picturesque, the aesthetic that had, of course, emerged triumphant over the course of the 18th century in England. The 18th century picturesque landscape garden, striving for the appearance of natural, the art of improvement having been applied with a seemingly deceptively easy hand through asymmetry with visual interest supplied through the texture and colors of plants, especially the new textures and colors supplied by the newly tapped botanical riches of North American colonies. But these conflicting descriptions are also rooted in a little explored, intersecting, sometimes conflicting, rich exchange of plants between French and American governments and private individuals in this period of history. Recovery of this period of this history does much to reveal not only what was growing in gardens on both sides of the Atlantic, but what these plants tell us about those who sought them. Europeans wrestling with notions of nature and society looked to pre-colonial America for inspiration as well as plants. In summary but lyrical words that illustrated European ideas about America, as opposed to understanding of it, John Locke had written in 2 treatises on government, "In the beginning, all the world was America." The words gave voice to the notion that the American continents, which Europeans of the late 17th century considered sparsely peopled with, quote, natural men or noble savages, as they termed the Native Americans, lush with vegetation and rich in forest, represented a paradise or Garden of Eden of sorts. As such, to them, the continents represented a wealth of resources untapped by the, quote, civilized European world. But Europeans were ambivalent about this American fertility. Buffon famously expressed skepticism about the productions of American soil, which may have been fertile, he believed, but which he argued the American climate would lead to American degeneracy. Alternatively, Hector Saint-Jean de Crèvecoeur, the Frenchman who defined what it meant to be an American in his Letters from an American Farmer, wrote favorably of American potential. "Men," he wrote, "are like plants. The goodness and flavor of the fruit proceeds from the peculiar soil and exposition in which they grow." But Crèvecoeur's ideas that soil and setting determined the outcome, written in celebration of America, not only voiced an avenue for overcoming the theoretical uncertainty about American climate, but also meet French political and economic needs. If European plants and peoples transplanted to America might degenerate over time, American plants and people transplanted back to civilization would, with proper cultivation, flourish. It was botanical realpolitik. This idea was interpreted literally by those botanists and plant hunters who, as part of the government-built colonial machine, scoured the earth for plants and trees that would serve European objectives. Sources of timber, economy-changing cash crops like tobacco and sugar, dietary-changing crops like the tomato and eventually potato. The French turned their diplomats into plant hunters, their naval officers into timber experts. Such were the stakes of colonial botany in the late 18th century. And so in the midst of these escalating attempts to negotiate the botanical needs of the state, Louis XVI had dispatched André Michaud to North America with the charge to gather North American plants that could, quote, find a happy culture in France. Michaud was one of the most important and most productive botanical cogs in this colonial machine. And over the course of a decade that he spent in North America, he worked incessantly to furnish the French government, its botanical gardens, with the specimens that it sought. But the tendrils of his botanical reach also extended into the private realm and demonstrate the rich scope of botanical exchange between public and private gardens, between scientists and amateurs, between French and American. American colonists had, of course, brought with them and continued to import the seeds and plants that they needed to reproduce European agriculture on American soil. And they quickly adapted agricultural practices to encompass the crops and the practices, including the institution of the enforced enslavement of Africans and Native Americans that embodied colonial agriculture, cultivation of tobacco, corn, potato, sugar, coffee. But the centrality of garden culture to Western identity and aesthetic fed interest in creating on American soil pleasure gardens furnished with the same kinds of plants that the French and the Europeans more broadly were using in their own gardens. French diplomats tasked with identifying sources of American plants complained that, quote, gardening was in its infancy in America. But there's much evidence that gardens were more than utilitarian on this side of the Atlantic. When Hyde Marguerite Hyde de Neuville, a French royalist and expatriate who waited out the fall of Napoleon in the United States with her husband, recorded vignettes of American life in watercolor and pencil. She took note of the importance of plants in American landscapes of home. In her drawing of the Moreau house that you see here, the estate occupied most likely by fellow French exiles, she recorded both a deliberate planting of trees around the home and a garden characterized with sculptures, a chain fence, a large number of flowering plants and shrubs in large pots that were placed at specific intervals around the fence. Plants were equally important to the more modest cottage, also recorded by Hyde de Neuville, where deliberately planted trees and potted shrubs joined a doghouse in the yard, while numerous potted flowers adorned the porch rail. These images hint at a larger garden culture based in large part, though not exclusively, on European aesthetic trends that crossed the Atlantic, largely because American gardeners, like their European counterparts, practiced gardening by sharing practitioners. There's considerable evidence of indentured servants coming to fill spots as gardeners in larger homes, and because they shared the bookishness of their European contemporaries. 18th century Americans were reading books on agriculture, botany, and gardening, both from England and France. William Livingston, the governor of New Jersey, to whom Michaud had appealed, assembled a library with English and continental works. He recorded, his library doesn't exist any longer, but we have his book list. And in the section on botany or plants and agriculture, he included, as you can see here, works that are both specifically scientific and botanical in nature, but also about the construction of gardens. So here you have Ray, for example. But he also had the To Be Expected, John Evelyn Silva, Philip Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, and Batty Langley. His cousin, Robert R. Livingston, who built a greenhouse and an extensive garden on his Hudson River estate, published a catalog of his library in which can be found a variety of French and English works on agriculture and husbandry, on the pleasure garden, and on the science of botany. Here's an illuminated manuscript of Columella, another volume that was also in Livingston's collection. Thomas Jefferson's more extensive library included a broad range of books on botany, from the classics to Parkinson, Tournefort, Linnaeus, Rousseau, Bradley, as well as volumes specifically on North America. He owned English, Italian, and French works on agriculture, including Olivier de Serres' Maison Rustique, and the same, of course, Evelyn Silva, Miller's Gardener's Dictionary, that he owned in English and French, as well as Whately's Observations on Modern Gardens, that Jefferson used as a critical guidebook on his own tour of English gardens with John Adams. Books, after all, made it simpler to speak the same language of plants, and as would the Linnaean system of classification. Indeed, while in France, Jefferson invoked both when he urged a fellow Virginian, Richard Carey, who was writing to Jefferson to request French plants to use Linnaeus. He replied, "I do not know what the nutberry pine is. I have no Miller's Dictionary here. You must therefore always give the Linnaean name." Now, to source gardens, plants for their gardens, American customers relied on merchants and ship captains who regularly brought seeds to sell in merchant shops, who advertised their wares in newspapers, a good source to find out what's coming across the Atlantic. But Americans with means and connections bought directly. William Livingston was one such customer. A member of the Hudson River Valley, New York, Livingston clan, he had as a young man envisioned an ideal rural life spent in philosophic solitude that he described in a lengthy 1747 poem of that name. After 2 decades of working as an attorney in Manhattan and with a personal library that we just referenced, stocked with books on botany and gardening, he set in motion plans to realize his youthful dream with the purchase of a plot of land outside Elizabethtown, New Jersey. This estate is now the site of my own university. Even before he began construction on the house, though, he started construction of an orchard. Apple trees he sourced locally, but for plums and pears, he turned to Gordon, Dermer, and Thompson in London, acquiring trees in 1767 and again in 1769, when he prevailed upon a friend who was visiting London to buy for him law books and scions of 59 different pear trees that were listed in the document here, and 27 different plums. From James Gordon at Thistle and Brown, number 10 in Fenchurch Street. Gordon, ironically, at this point, was becoming known in London as an expert in the cultivation of American specimens for English gardens. At the bottom of the pear and plum order, Livingston added and let the nurseryman put 2 quarts of horse chestnuts at the bottom of the box, into which he puts the scions. At least one of those horse chestnuts survived the voyage, germinated, and grew into the tree that still stands at the entrance to Liberty Hall. It's celebrated as one of the oldest documented trees in New Jersey and is testimony to American interest in formal gardens, even among the more modest elites that Livingston represented. The desire for trees, fruit trees, flowering shrubs and flowers was sufficient to support multiple commercial operations in America, of which the Bartrams was only the most famous. In the Philadelphia area, Humphry Marshall, a relative of Bartram, also had a flourishing business, as did William Prince in New York. Improving one's estate meant furnishing it with plants and trees from notable nurseries. It was deemed valuable enough, as you'll see in this newspaper ad, for the sale of a property in which it highlights a young bearing orchard of 400 trees, and the fruit garden is furnished with a variety of peaches, plums, and cherries, and many others selected from Prince's celebrated nursery on Long Island. Similarly, in 1807, the New Jersey Journal advertised a farm in Belleville, New Jersey, that included, quote, a variety of fruit trees in full bearing procured from Prince's nursery. The William Prince Nursery flourished on Long Island for decades, included George Washington and Thomas Jefferson among its customers, and over time, 3 generations of the Prince family developed an extensive stock of their own cultivars. Prince maintained a fascinating internal list of local and regional sites where he knew of interesting or notable fruit trees that he intended to sample and cultivate. For example, he lists new sorts of fruit and such that may be obtained, including a crabapple in the ditch east of Saint-Germain, or a cherry ripe in September at Oyster Bay, inquire of Walter Franklin. But even as Prince was developing his own stock from American sources, he was also a wholesale importer of English and continental fruit trees from none other than Gordon Forsyth and Company, the surviving incarnation in the very early part of the 19th century of Gordon, Dermer, and Thompson. While Prince made it easier to acquire seeds and plants from elite American and European nurseries, some, though, sought to exploit the French diplomacy of the kind that we've already described, including a man named Richard Carey. He was a judge, a member of the Supreme Court of Virginia, and he figured out how to leverage French desire for American plants to furnish his own garden in Warwick, Virginia. When Carey learned that Martin Auster, who was the French vice consul serving in Richmond, had, like other French diplomats before him in the years running up to the arrival of André Michaux, been directed to gather American plants to send back to France, Carey raised his hand and said, "I will do it, I will help you." But he asked for French reciprocity. "If," he wrote, "in another year you find yourself in need of other items, I would with very great pleasure be obliged for you to depend upon me. And nothing would add more to my satisfaction than to maintain a correspondence with some amateurs in France. I flatter myself that this would be the means to procure such great pleasure by a reciprocal exchange of the productions of nature. The inhabitants of the two countries cannot only receive pleasure, but also great advantage." In that passage, Carey has asked to be admitted to that Botanical Republic of Letters, but he's also asking for plants. And as you see on this list that has both the English names of plants and the French translations of those plants, he is asking for ornamental flowers, tulips, hyacinths, ranunculus, anemone, dianthus, auriculas, expensive, highly desired flowers that were, of course, central to the ways in which to the kinds of flowers that were included in formal European gardens. He also, reflecting the 18th century interest in growing new varieties of vegetables, asked for cauliflower, broccoli, and cantaloupe seeds and fruit trees. But the flowers were front and center in what he was requesting. The French filled the order. They were happy to reciprocate if they could get the American specimens that they wanted from the Virginia region. But when many of the specimens did not survive transatlantic transport, Carey very audaciously asked for more, trying the French patience who had little interest in cultivating botanical conversation with the man. I've yet to uncover evidence of how Carey planted his French flowers in his American garden, although it is known that the garden consisted of terraces that descended from his home, Pear Tree Hall, down to the riverbank. Nor is there evidence that Carey was able to actually leverage his American plant gathering into an entree into that Botanical Republic of Letters. But his floral demands of the French show us that Americans like him and like William Livingston and William Prince's customers desired to be part of the world of plants that offered Americans material entree into the fashionable, bookish, and scientific world of the metropole. The presence of colonial botanists like André Michaux would also offer the possibility for Americans to acquire specimens that the French were gathering from other parts of the world. And this was part of the initial offer that the French had made. Before they sent Michaux, they said, "Can you all please," to the Americans, "can you all please establish a botanical garden and then we'll trade specimens with you?" The French had tried to leverage that into pushing the Americans into creating their own botanical garden. The French were premature in making that request. The Americans aren't going to do that until the early parts of the 19th century. And it's not well into the late 1820s and the 1830s that they succeed in actually establishing an institution in Washington, D.C. that would serve that particular purpose. But Michaux is an example of how, despite the lack of a national American institution to facilitate that exchange, plants did indeed come from Europe, plants that had initially come from around the globe. The French had encouraged Michaux's predecessors in search of North American botanical knowledge to befriend American elites, as they assumed that landowning went hand in hand with botanical curiosity and familiarity. The director of the Bâtiment du Roi instructed French diplomats preceding Michaux's mission to reach out to large landowners who might be presumed to be botanically knowledgeable about North American plant life. And to a certain extent, the French were right. Michaux, for example, paid a visit to Thomas Jefferson at Monticello, who, in addition to maintaining formal grounds around Monticello, also included the vegetable garden that you see here, where he experimented with lots of different kinds of specimens that he was, of course, importing from Europe as much as he was able, and buying, of course, from William Prince's nursery and so forth. He also went to visit George Washington. after having been introduced to Washington by the Marquis de Lafayette. Washington's interest in plants was already well known. Lafayette had contacted Washington for American seeds on behalf of Hector St. Jean de Crèvecoeur, performing that botanical diplomacy. Here at Mount Vernon, in addition to the formal grounds surrounding the home, is Washington's basically experimental garden, where he was growing and trying out different fruits and vegetables. Michaud stayed in contact with Washington after the visit, sending him seeds in which he promised had come from the French king's garden. Michaud wrote to Washington saying, "I will accept the offer that you made me in sending to your care the collections that I shall make in the distant countries for the use of the King of France." In other words, Michaud is promising to share. Michaud, like French diplomats before him, used the gift of plants and seeds to secure assistance and information. As I already referenced, when William Livingston had been asked to provide information about the state of New Jersey, he was thanked with a gift of seeds from the French consul, to which Livingston asked very pointedly whether or not these gifts of plants that had come from monarchical climes, he wrote, would be harmed by the Republican soil in which he planted them. Michaud is credited with introducing a number of different species to the American landscape. These attributions are always tricky because Michaud is of course one of the most important, but hardly the only person in the Atlantic world bringing in specimens from Europe. But he's credited with introducing the Lombardy poplar to the Mid-Atlantic region, where it grew in his New Jersey garden. He befriended Charles Drayton, who visited Michaud's garden in Charleston, and gifted Drayton with shrubs that were believed to include the camellia that he then planted at Drayton Hall. He's also credited with introducing the camellia to the gardens at Middleton Place, today one of the show places of the camellia. He solicited from France, and there are wonderfully documented lists of plants that Michaud wrote to his superiors in France with an entire list. These are the plants that I need you to send me. And these are the plants that we know he was then sharing with those with whom he interacted, including the ginkgo, the mimosa, the tea olive, among others. In other words, Michaud was facilitating access to many of the plants that would go on to then characterize the landscapes of the American South. Meanwhile, Thomas Jefferson was in Paris in 1786, fielding requests from our Richard Carey, whom we've already met, for French plants. And he wrote to Carey requesting a selection of American plants, including azaleas, magnolias, commias, rhododendrons, which he wrote are desired in great quantities by his French acquaintances. In the same letter, Jefferson enclosed the seeds of ranunculus, broccoli and cauliflower, and tulip bulbs that Carey had requested, and promised that carnations, auriculas, tuberoses, hyacinths, and lilies that Carey wanted would be forthcoming. But that Jefferson desired American plants in Paris suggested that he was doing some leveraging of his own to help the French acquire American shrubs and flowering trees. The stylistic developments of the mid to later 18th century, the Picturesque garden, of course, crossed the English Channel, as did the aesthetic need to acquire American plants to achieve them. Aesthetically, plantations of trees added visual interest and contour to otherwise ordinary ground as they framed perspectives and so forth. Variety of trees mattered in the French picturesque garden, as illustrated by Georges Louis Le Rouge, in which he depicts here the plantation of trees in ascending height and profile. He has an entire chart of the different trees of different heights and how they should, it's a chart that challenges our best Excel work to allow you to choose the right combination of tree heights to create the look, the theatrical planting that you wanted to achieve in your picturesque garden. In addition, he added that variation would come from the range of leaf shape and color. that existed in many of the trees included in his charts. He celebrated the variety of leaf shape in an arboreal flight of fancy with this tree that bears the leaves of 61 different specimens growing out of a single trunk. Of course, no such specimen existed, but American trees, the point is that American trees and shrubs were used in France as they were in England to heighten the variety of size, shape, and color and texture in the garden. Importantly, they had the added benefit of appealing to the intellectual curiosity and botanical fashion of the day. For while ancient oak trees harken back to ancient philosophical traditions and history, American trees suggested a more modern botanical age and a newly global one. Not all garden theorists favored incorporating American trees into the French garden. Among late 18th century French gardening manuals who debated this question, Girardin was skeptical of using foreign trees for the desired effect. Quote, "They are not only difficult and expensive to raise and still more difficult to preserve, but they seldom accord well with the trees of our country." When the decision was made to undertake the replantation of the gardens of Versailles, Abbé Nolin and André Thuin proposed the use of exotic specimens, American trees. Ultimately, though, they decided that, and despite the fact, and you can see that illustrated in this Hubert Robert painting, that the old trees, as they were being taken out of the gardens, were being transformed into usable lumber, it was still deemed too expensive to use American trees in the gardens, and they decided that cheaper oaks and chestnuts would have to do. Despite 18th century garden theorist ambivalence about American plants, French garden owners and gardeners wanted them, and they found ways to get them, whether through French diplomats in America, Americans like Jefferson serving as a diplomat and visiting France, or through other channels. One of the most interesting sources of this information comes through the diary of Thomas Blakey, a Scottish gardener to a number of elite clients in the 1780s in France, including the Duc de Chartres. Blakey kept a diary that offers a salty peek into the world of 18th century French gardeners and their patrons. In it, he took notes of the plants of the collections in and around Paris. And he specifically noted American plants in French gardens. As he was launching his work for the Duc de Chartres at the Parc de Monceau, Blakey traveled around Paris looking at other collections. He went with André Thuin, who from the Jardin du Roi, the Royal Botanical Garden, to see, for example, the gardens of Le Monnier, another figure associated with the Royal Gardens, and reported, quote, "Here is a fine collection of American plants and in fine order, the healthiest I've seen anywhere in France. They are exceedingly well shaded and all sown upon what they call terreau de brouillard, which is black, healthy sand, not peat." He's always looking at how they're doing and how they're being cared for. When Blakey saw the gardens of the Chevalier de Moustel, he wrote, "He has a good selection and many scarce plants, and his American plants, quote, are in good order. He has a good method of overflowing his boggy American plants." He visited the collection of Abbé Nolin, who was in charge of the Royal Nursery, inspector of all the king's nurseries, at Roule on the edge of Paris, which was very near the Parc Monceau. And he wrote, quote, "This gentleman is not so much of a botanist as one would be imagined to occupy such a place, but his American plants is very healthy." Blakey's account tells us that the 18th century French elites, like their contemporaries across the English Channel, valued rare and exotic plants, and American plants chief among them. Blakey intended the same for the Duc de Chartres. He judged the Jardin de Monceau to be a mess. Quote, "The garden is a confusion of temples, ruins crowded one upon another, in which place you see a Gothic ruin, and just beyond that a Grecian, and next to that a Chinese temple. The whole a small confusion of many things joined together without any great natural plan, the walks serpenting and turning without reason, which is the fault of most of these gardens done without taste or reason." In writing the many wrongs that he believed had been committed at Monceau, Blakey sought to turn it into a botanical showplace and worked at cultivating the Duke's interest in exotics. He wrote in 1783, "After I changed most of these gardens and destroyed most of the walks, which I thought unnecessary or unnatural, These changes wrought a great effect upon the gardens and upon the mind of the Duke, who began to see the difference from the changes I made. To acquire suitably varied and exotic plants for the garden at Monceau, Blakey scoured Parisian and London nurseries, but he also went directly to American commercial outlets, who were increasingly targeting a French commercial base. Most importantly, Humphry Marshall and the Bartrams. Archival sources show that Blakey and the Duc de Chartres purchased a great number of American specimens from John Bartram and his Philadelphia cousin and seedsman Humphry Marshall. In 1785, Marshall had published his Arbustrum Americanun, The American Grove. The volume is one of the first books published on American plants by an American, but perhaps inspired by the success of the Bartrams and Bartram boxes, Marshall targeted a larger clientele, writing, quote, "The foreigner, curious in American collections, will be hereby better enabled to make a selection suitable to his own particular fancy." And in 1788, it was translated into French by the assistant director of the Pépinière du Roi in Paris. Marshall's archives reveal that even before the translation of his catalog, he was doing business with a great range of French customers. First and foremost, the French officials who'd been posted to the United States. Marshall had been engaged to supply seeds for the French government via requests placed by diplomats posted to Philadelphia. But Marshall also catered to private clients. Stephen Girard, a Frenchman who'd settled in Philadelphia years earlier, served as a go-between, writing to Marshall, "Sir, being requested by a gentleman in Paris to apply to you for the following plants, including magnolia, kalmia, franklinia, and azaleas." And Etienne Thomas de Massion, here familiar images of the magnolia, kalmia, and franklinia. Forwarding an order from Etienne Thomas de Massion, intendant of Rouen, who ordered plants and seeds for the Chateau de Janville, shown here. The Greek temple still survives from the garden. In 1787, he received a large order from Adrienne Catherine, Comtesse de Noailles de Tessé, who was also a frequent correspondent and good friend to Thomas Jefferson and to the Marquis de Lafayette, and a passionate gardener who constructed a picturesque garden at the Chateau de Chaville. Blakey and the Duc de Chartres were also Marshall customers. Blakey acquired a large number of plants outlined in a 5-page document, the full contents of which I'm still analyzing. It includes the necessary detailed instructions on packing and shipping for that transatlantic voyage. It included requests for specimens in both seed form and in live plant form. And among the very different species requested are varieties of sweet gum, sassafras, magnolia, American plum, viburnum, alders, birches, maples, oaks, gardenia, mock orange, mountain ash, summer sweet, franklinia, azaleas, blueberries, rhododendrons, kalmia, as well as vining species of trumpet vine and birthwort. The order requested that the species be divided into different boxes, perhaps intended for different destinations, or perhaps hoping that if shipments got separated, at least some of everything would arrive. The specific gardens in which the specimens were to be planted are not identified, but each box was to contain a broad variety of the seeds listed. Collectively, they would have eventually contributed to a wide range of colors and shape to the landscape. And the writer of the list added the request, "We ask of Mr. Bartram that he send 4 or 5 boxes of the sort that he's already sent to France." That the order was filled is suggested by another document in the Archives Nationales, a list of seeds and plants that you see here. From the that arrived from America in 1788, seeded in the different gardens of Monsieur le Duc d'Orléans. The seed list includes over 200 different varieties, many of which appear in the order from Marshall. It includes hundreds of pines, cedars, 2 cases of plants, 2 cases of plants, 2 cases of seeds from Bartram and Marshall on the document. 1 furnished by Dr. Franklin, 2 from Marshall, 2 from Bartram, all totaling 3,146 livres, a considerable sum. It's not clear for which of the Duke's gardens, as I said, these plants on the seed list were intended, but hints of Blakey's work excuse me, are visible in Larouche's engravings of Monceau, which were produced subsequent to the famous images that clientele made of the place. Two images show representations of the Berceau d'Hiver at Monceau, a complex structure that included a greenhouse and a grotto, the Jardin d'Hiver, where rare botanical plants acquired from Monceau could be cultivated and enjoyed. Were they enjoyed as distinctly American specimens or as part of the botanical largesse that made up the picturesque landscape and flourishing greenhouse that we see here? Frustratingly few clues as to how exotics and American plants were incorporated into the French gardens of the era survive, but there are a few. The French colonial machine, constructed and supported financially and institutionally by the French monarchy, was rocked, of course, by the outbreak of the French Revolution in 1789, and then the Declaration of the Republic in 1792. The ability of the Parisian Jardin du Roi to weather the political storm and come out the other side as the Jardin des Plantes, a paragon of a national institution serving the new citizens of France, has been narrated, of course, by E.C. Sperry. For botanists in the field, like Michaud, who'd been dispatched to North America by Louis XVI, the revolution brought welcome political change. He proudly signed his letters as citizen, but financial and operational turbulence. The new Republican government was not forthcoming with the funds necessary to continue Michaud's work. As the Republican government became steadier on its feet, however, it carried out an assessment of ongoing missions. It looked at Michaud's New Jersey and Charleston gardens and determined that while the Charleston garden offered access to belle plante from Florida, Louisiana, and the Carolinas that were suitable for botanical gardens or the progress of science, the New Jersey garden, which had generated trees that were successfully being acclimated in France, produced objects less curious but of greater utility. The New Jersey operation would be allowed to continue, but the French government ordered that the Charleston garden be sold. Michaud tried to tout the economic and agricultural potential of global botanical exchange by proposing a botanical resuscitation of the sterile soil in a region near Bordeaux called the Landes, where ever-shifting sand dunes hampered agriculture. You see here people of the region in the Landes actually were walking on stilts because the sandy, boggy soil made it difficult to walk through. Michaud promised that in trying to tout the utilitarian nature of the scientific work that he was conducting, he argued that a list of plants that you see here that includes items from all over the world, but which some of whom he was encountering in the Americas, could be brought back to this particular region of France and actually transform what had been sterile, agriculturally useless soil that had kept this particular spot in this region bogged down in poverty into a flourishing landscape, a productive landscape. As you see, it mapped the origins of many of these specimens that Michaud believed showed the promise of global botany. His proposal was not realized, but the government remained convinced of the merits of colonial botany. In France, the transformation of the once monarchical climate into Republican soil wrought havoc in parterre and picturesque alike, as the property of French nobility and financial elites who were deemed too close to the monarchy were seized. So too were the plants in their gardens. The botanical trophies were uprooted and taken to the Jardin des Plantes to become public property of the nation. The seizures were carefully documented. When the property of the Marquis de Laborde at Méréville that you see here was taken, the Jardin des Plantes, led by André Thuan, assembled an inventory of the objects, as you see here, the objects of Botanique, which are found at Méréville in the house of Laborde, who, as you see here on this document, was condemned to death. The Marquis's fortune was acquired largely at the expense of enslaved laborers on his sugar plantations in Saint-Domingue, and was spent in part on the construction of Merville's extensive gardens. Among the many specimens potted and planted recording in the inventory can be found specimens identified specifically as American specimens. Here you see the Kalmia, and you see rhododendron, d'Amérique listed on this inventory. Here you see elms listed as particularly American. Others were singled out. He identifies some Canadian specimens, some coming specifically from Virginia. It was a list that reflected the same sort of ornamental and botanically curious plants that Michaud was gathering in his Charleston Garden. While American specimens had been subsumed into the larger whole, incorporated into different features all over Laborde's garden, planted among the French trees and flowers, they still retained their American identity and were singled out as such in this inventory. Thoin was impressed by the extent of the collection and the condition of the specimens within it. He noted in his report, if this place had been planted by someone who would have had the taste of botany and who would have liked to make a school of trees, it would have been very good, all the more so because the earth allowed the plants to be spaced so as not to harm each other, and to hope that they could acquire individually all the development which nature wanted them to be achieved that can only be met in the state of liberté. Ironically, Laborde's ill-gotten wealth and monarchical complicity had afforded his global trees the requisite liberty to thrive. The state of liberty of Laborde's trees necessarily raises the question of liberty enjoyed and taken from the peoples related to plant exchange in a colonial context. Neither the plants exchanged across the Atlantic nor the people who collected and cultivated them can be extricated from the systems of colonialism and enslavement that shaped the Atlantic world. At Liberty Hall, William Livingston, for example, claimed ownership over an unknown number of enslaved persons before manumitting the last two in 1786. William Prince carried out his nursery business with the labor of Sally, a Black girl and indentured servant, he wrote, who absented herself without leave on several occasions. And he records the money expended to recover her. Anne Hyde de Neuville, who documented these modest American plants and gardens, also documented in paint the Native Americans, mostly Oneida peoples she encountered in upstate New York, as well as the enslaved Africans who were part of the early Republican American landscape that she experienced in exile. As Michaud explored North America, he did so with the hired help of Native Americans and the purchased labor of enslaved Africans. Michaud recorded none of their names in his journals, but he did record the Native American plant names and usages, botanical knowledge likely gleaned from the Native American guides he employed. Botanical knowledge and practices also came from enslaved peoples, but it's harder to account for that in Michaud's journal. But when Michaud returned to France, he took one enslaved man identified in documents as Merlot with him. The same man, described as an apprentice gardener, accompanied Michaud as an assistant on his expedition to Madagascar, to which Michaud departed after he returned to France. After Michaud's death on Madagascar, Merlot worked as a gardener for the king and nobles in Madagascar, but his fate is uncertain. Surviving documents suggest that he was sold into slavery, later freed again. Merlot had learned Michaud's scientific trade and found himself ultimately transplanted to the other side of a world in which both plants and people were transplanted into both new and familiar contexts. The relocation of Merlot, the African gardener, from South Carolina to Madagascar, and the dislocation of Laborde's American plants to the Jardin des Plantes bring us back to the questions animating the beginning of this essay, the contrasting views of Michaud's New Jersey garden, William Livingston wondering on paper whether the Republican soil would alter seeds from monarchical climes. Unfortunately, there's no record of what came of the French seeds that Livingston planted in New Jersey, but revisiting his words calls us to query what was altered in the moving landscapes of the late 18th century, in the location, the dislocation, the relocation of people and plants. The dislocation of European plants into American gardens was part of efforts to relocate Americans into the cosmopolitan world defined for them by those on the far side of the Atlantic. The dislocation of American plants into European gardens reinforced the colonial power of the Europeans who were collecting the world, exploiting the arboreal, botanical, and other natural resources they encountered to secure their position of dominance. The colonial transplantation across the globe of commercially viable plants, such as sugarcane, transformed landscapes into sites of plantation agriculture, sites that consumed the labor and the lives of the more violently transplanted enslaved persons brought to bring colonial agriculture to bear fruit. The plants enmeshed in diplomatic, geopolitical, scientific, and cultural networks of power were thus tools in early modern identity making. The reciprocal exchange of productions of nature, as Carrie had put it, brought European plants to America in attempts to bring America into an intellectually and scientifically cosmopolitan world. American plants transported to France to create a vision of nature that was inspired and demanded by evolving 18th century aesthetics. And monarchical and republican governments alike sought profit and progress through the conquest and capture of nature. Sometime shortly after 1800, when Jefferson was taking stock of his life's contributions, he asserted the greatest service which one can be rendered any country is to add a useful plant to its culture. Europeans like Laborde had already profited wildly from colonial botany's success stories like sugar and coffee, becoming not just colonial planters, but also people who claimed ownership over human beings. The transplantation of such plants created the financial incentive for them to transform Africans like Merlot and his ancestors into enslaved people. Michaud's trees were sent to the Jardin des Plantes and Rambouillet, but for a range of reasons, never built a French navy, nor were his plans for the Landes region executed. Neither Livingston's Liberty Hall nor Richard Carey's Pear Tree Hall would be confused for European estates, and neither Monceau nor Merivale would be mistaken for natural landscapes. So I've asked if plants make place. I'm not so sure. The landscapes described, real and never realized, were poetic lies and botanical truths. Using plants, I conclude, to try to make place actually seems to have done more to make people. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Beth, for that survey of the trade across the North Atlantic, which is similar to that in England, but also quite distinct. There are a couple of questions at the moment, so everybody, if you've got a question for Beth, then this will be the moment to add it to the chat. Michael's asking, Beth, was there any evidence of a trade war between the French and the British to be either the premier suppliers or the importers from the new market?
What the French were specifically trying to do at the juncture when they got involved in American, specifically North American plant trade, was to take advantage of the fact that the British were on their way out. They assumed that in context of the American Revolution, the British, who had been very successfully able to exploit North American forests for the sake of the British Navy, would cease to be acquiring timber from New England. And they assume that they will be able to work their way into American trade. There are a couple of pieces of evidence you find. For example, William Livingston fielding questions from French diplomats, including, most importantly, the Marquis de Marbois, who is asking about what it's going to take to get Americans to increase trade with France. Livingston's having none of the diplomatic niceties, and he basically replied to Marbois, the Americans are going to go where they can get the best prices. The Americans are going to go where they can get goods most simply. And of course, Livingston would prove to be correct on that. There are efforts to actually negotiate some trade deals, and Thomas Jefferson is involved in this. And you see that they are working prior to the French Revolution to actually reduce tariffs on the importation of American plants and trees into France and vice versa. So they actually do take action to facilitate a more competitive trade in botanical specimens, in trees between the two countries. So the answer is yes. I wouldn't call it a war, but I would call it a policy-driven conversation.
From an American point of view, did that change after the French Revolution?
So the first the American Revolution and then the French Revolution interrupted the exchange of plants across the Atlantic because of the difficulties of actually transporting people and goods safely. The American reluctance to get involved politically in the French Revolution, I think, facilitated American willingness to maintain previous British trade connections. So yes, the French Revolution interrupts that. There's another really interesting piece of this story that I think also that connects to all the things that we've talked about today, that steers the Americans again away from France. So André Michaux, when the French Republic stopped paying him while he was in North America, he negotiated an arrangement with Thomas Jefferson, who was then the president of the American Philosophical Society in Philadelphia, to in fact explore the American West on behalf of the American Philosophical Society. Essentially, he was going to be the Lewis and Clark a decade before Lewis and Clark. They negotiated the terms. It's a fascinating, I've got a new article out on that. It's a fascinating exchange by which Jefferson and Barton and others from the American Philosophical Society are working to come to terms that would be acceptable to Michaux, who still very much saw himself as a citizen of France, and therefore unwilling to become obligated to the American government, but willing to serve the international world of science on behalf of the American Philosophical Society. And yet he's also entitled to the rights to publish anything that he discovers and so forth. It's a really fascinating negotiation of terms. And so Michaux was ready to carry out that expedition when the French Republican government sent a new envoy to the United States, Edmond Genet. Citizen Genet, as new consul, had his own plans of what he thought the French government should be doing from its diplomatic outpost in North America, which really reflects, and this is one of the pieces that is a large part of the story. While the United States has become an independent country, we know that France and Britain and the Spanish and the Americans are all looking at the rest of the North American continent, and especially everything west of the Appalachians, and still thinking very imperially, and looking at who's going to control that territory. So this Michaux expedition is part of that. It's part of an American attempt to lay claim to that territory. But Genet wanted to recruit Americans, especially in the Tennessee-Kentucky frontier, to help the French throw the Spanish out of Louisiana. He wanted to retake control of the Mississippi Delta, in New Orleans especially. And so Genet ordered Michaux to take documents to Tennessee with the details of this plot. So Michaux essentially becomes sort of a spy with the knowledge of Jefferson in trying to recruit Americans to help this French cause, to help the French regain traction in North America. Once that was exposed, George Washington would have none of it, and Edmond Genet was recalled, and that plot dissolved. But it also meant that Michaux never got to carry out his expedition to the Pacific on behalf of the American Philosophical Society. So you see this interconnection of imperial desire to control the rest of North America, connected to the Botanical mission, connected to American distrust of French motives, all in that one episode.
Yeah, thank you. So to the other question, this is Max asking about Le Jardin de Monceau.
Uh-huh.
Is that the one that's in the centre of Paris in the
Yes.
yeah.
Yeah.
He says that it is the map that you showed is different to what you see on the ground now.
Mhm.
So has it been reduced in size?
It has been reduced substantially. I couldn't tell you acreage wise by how much. It was a garden that was, it was a showplace for the Duc de Chartres. And Monceau was, all the things that Thomas Blakey hated about it were the things that made it all the rage when the Duc de Chartres first built it, because it was a showplace of follies and fabriques. There were sort of the 18th century merry-go-rounds. There was on display the famous engravings done by Carmontel of Monceau show the workers in the garden, not the gardeners themselves, but the people there to facilitate French aristocrats taking pleasure in the gardens, are dressed according to the exotic theme of the individual part of the garden, whether it was a Chinese element or it's a Turkish tent. So you have this French version of the exotic on display in these different temples, rooms, plantations, and so forth. It really was a playground for French aristocrats. That's of course what Blakey hated, and that is of course what he was trying to transform by introducing, by making it a showplace of plants instead of play. It's a garden though that managed to survive, not under the control of the Duc de Chartres. Revolution intervenes in that, but the garden itself survived and sort of has recovered its notion of play, though in a very different way.
Yeah. We're drawing to a close on the questions, but I wanted to ask you about Anne Hyde de Neuville.
Yeah.
Was she amateur or professional? And is it commonplace to have drawings of women from the late 18th century in American waving? But also, somebody has asked, Monica has asked, are you related to her?
I am not. But my Hyde ancestry is all English, and I don't seem to have any French ancestry to connect me to her family, and so I've not found any connection. I would not. She was an amateur, but an accomplished one, and she actually. There was a recent, so if anybody is interested in following up on her works, 2 years ago, I think right as COVID was erupting, the New York Historical Society in New York City staged a major exhibition of her works, and there is a volume of those works that the catalog to the exhibition that you can get in there, and a lot of scholarship that has been done on her. What is really fascinating, even more so about her drawings than her documentation of these sort of modest homes and plant life, is the people. She documented people that other artists were not documenting. As they were in exile, she was in upstate New York a good deal, and where she encountered a lot of Oneida peoples. And so there are a number of drawings of the Oneida, showing them in traditional dress and so forth, showing family units from which people are trying to glean cultural and social information. She was also, there were a number of French expatriates in New York, in the New York region, some of whom had fled after the Haitian Revolution. She becomes, I think, also associated with efforts to aid some of those exiles and their children. many of whom were in states of poverty, and so orphanages are established and schools are established, and she's part of some of those expat missions. She's a really interesting, really fascinating example of an amateur artist who provides a lot of social cultural evidence for that period of the early republic in America.
Yeah. Thank you, Beth. I'll hand us all back to
Okay.
Thank you.
Beth, that's an extraordinary crossing of not just continents, but of subjects and characters, and looking at Michaud's undertaking alone, but all the other people who are involved. And what I find particularly fascinating, the diplomatic and politico-economic use of plants. It's just, it's a fascinating subject on its own.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you from all of us. It's really been just amazing, and I think we will all go and probably watch this over and over again to really make the best use of it, and we look forward greatly to the book.